Screams echoed through the grand hall of Savannah as silk-clad bodies writhed on the polished floor, their jeweled hands clawing for air. Just moments before, laughter and music had filled the night, but now the city's proudest citizens collapsed one by one beneath the chandeliers. And at the center of it all stood a servant girl, silent, steady, holding the power of life and death in her calloused hands. What drove her to turn a glittering banquet into a scene of horror? Comment below with your guess before we uncover the shocking truth. The echo of screams still seemed to haunt the stone walls of the Blackwell cellar. Though above ground, the mansion was quiet that morning. Lantern light trembled against the casks of Madeira and brandy, throwing uneven shadows that seemed to watch Miriam as she moved. She paused by the shelf of corks, her fingers brushing one, carved with a small cross. To anyone else, it was a scrap of waste. To her, it was a keepsake, a remnant of the night Edward Blackwell had married Margaret and forced the household to labor until dawn, polishing, carrying, serving. Miriam had slipped the cork into her apron that night, a token of her realization that she would grow old and die in service if nothing changed. For years, she kept it hidden like a charm proof that memory could not be beaten out of her. At 40, Miriam was older than most of the other women in the household, though her hands had not grown slow. She knew the weight of each bottle and the scent of every vintage. She knew which cask would satisfy the mayor's sweet tooth and which cordial would make a banker loosen his purse strings. This knowledge had saved her when debts forced Edward to sell others. Not her, he had barked once. She knows the wines. In the world of slaves, being needed was the only shield. But need could also become leverage. Through the cracks in the floorboards, faint music drifted down. Ruth's voice carried a hymn she had been rehearsing with the church choir. Her tone was fragile, almost breaking, yet the words fell clear. Abide with me, fast falls the eventide. It was a song meant for the dying, though the mistress demanded it as practice for the banquet. Miriam closed her eyes. The sound tore at her, reminding her of the small face that no longer appeared in the servants' quarters. Naomi, Ruth's sister, only 13, taken as collateral for a debt. No chance to say farewell. No promise of reunion. Ruth had cried herself raw, muffling the sobs in her pillow so Margaret would not hear. Miriam had sat beside her, unable to offer more than silence. It had been Elijah who delivered the news. He shuffled into the cellar, back bent from decades of hauling cargo, his limp dragging behind him like a shadow. Caldwell took her, he whispered, naming the banker. His eyes had carried the dull weight of inevitability. Elijah remembered Miriam's mother remembered when she first came here as a girl of 14. He was the living thread that tied her to a past, already stripped of names and places. Yet even that thread was destined to fray. The week after Naomi's departure, Elijah was caught with a flask of rum. Deputy Cole accused him of stealing from the stock. The truth was crueler. Elijah had taken it to rub into his joints against the winter ache. Miriam saw him the next morning, ribs bruised, skin split. She tried to heal him in secret, sneaking honey and crushed herbs, whispering prayers. But the body of an old man cannot absorb brutality forever. Within days, fever claimed him. There was no funeral, no headstone, just a patch of earth by the dock. Miriam placed a stone herself, a gesture unseen, then walked back to the cellar and stared at the hidden wooden box behind the Madeira casks. Inside lay the packet of arsenic she had purchased years before from a chemist's clerk who had smirked as he handed it over. For rats, he said. She had not dared to touch it then. Now grief and rage made her hands steady as iron. That night, she broke off a crust of stale bread, dipped it in broth, and sprinkled the powder lightly across its surface. She placed it in a dark corner where the dock rats crept. By dawn, one lay stiff, body curled grotesquely. Her heart hammered, yet she felt no fear, only clarity. She swept the corpse away and went back to work. Later, as she lifted her lantern, her reflection caught in the polished brass mirror on the wall, a French piece Edward liked to show his guests. She barely recognized herself. Hollow cheeks, eyes sharpened by years of silent watching, framed by the scarf she always wore. She was not the shadow she had been forced to become. She was a vessel of judgment, holding in her hands the measure of life and death. Above, Margaret's shrill voice pierced the air. More Madeira. And quickly Miriam blew out the lantern and tucked the cork with the cross into her apron pocket. Her steps up the stairs sounded louder than usual, each one leading toward the glitter of chandeliers and polished marble, toward the guests who would soon drink from her decanters. Each one also pulled her deeper into the plan that was forming as precisely as any ledger of bottles she had ever kept. The night of Savannah's grandest celebration was approaching fast. What no one yet knew was that it would not end with music and fireworks, but with bodies collapsing beneath chandeliers, their jeweled hands clawing for breath. And in the cellar below, Miriam was already counting down. Savannah's winter sun cut through the shutters of the servants' quarters, laying pale stripes across the straw pallets. Ruth sat on the edge of her bedding, her hands clenched around a scrap of ribbon that had once belonged to her sister. Naomi's absence was a wound that bled without sound. She had been taken swiftly, almost casually handed to a carriage belonging to Caldwell, the city's bank president. Edward Blackwell had not even deigned to announce the decision. For him, the transaction was no more remarkable than settling a bill of flour. For Ruth, it was the unraveling of her entire world. Miriam watched the girl's hollow eyes and thought of her own children long gone, traded like ledgers of debt. She remembered the numb silence when her son was taken as a boy, the empty space where her daughter had slept. Those losses were carved into her bones, but seeing them repeated in Ruth's trembling frame stirred something that had been dormant for years. Grief had turned to something sharper. That afternoon, as Miriam descended once more into the damp cellar, she found Elijah leaning against a barrel, his breath labored. The old longshoreman had worked for the Blackwells longer than anyone could remember. His body carried the marks of decades, twisted knees, a limp that pulled him sideways, a scar across his cheek from a rope that snapped in a storm. He had always spoken gently to Miriam like an uncle guarding scraps of memory. He beckoned her close, lowering his cracked voice. "Debt's worse than ever. Blackwell gambled at the Harbor Club last night. Lost heavy. They're saying he'll sell more, maybe even me." He coughed, the sound rattling deep in his chest. "Man like me won't fetch much, so they'll send me south." Miriam felt the familiar weight settle in her stomach. Being sold south was a sentence more feared than the whip in exile to the brutal fields where old men did not last a season. "You've given him everything," she murmured. Elijah gave a tired smile. "Everything don't mean much to men like him." Days later, the prophecy came to pass in another form. Elijah was caught with a bottle of rum tucked beneath his coat. Deputy Cole, the sheriff's man hired to oversee order during the preparations, dragged him into the courtyard. Miriam from the kitchen doorway watched as Cole's baton struck again and again, each blow landing on brittle bones. The accusation was theft, but Miriam knew better. Elijah had once confessed that he used the liquor to soothe the pain in his joints. She found him that evening in the storage shed, his body mottled with bruises, one eye swollen shut. She knelt beside him with honey and herbs stolen from the kitchen. "You shouldn't risk it," he whispered, his voice thin as smoke. Miriam pressed her hand to his and shook her head. "We look after our own." His fingers, rough and trembling, clutched hers. "He'll sell me, after the banquet. Said so himself." The words struck her like cold water. She looked into his eyes, clouded now, but still carrying the remnants of dignity, and felt something rip inside her. Elijah had been her anchor, the only living witness to her past. Without him, she would be adrift in silence. Within 3 days, fever consumed him. The infection spread through the cuts Cole had left. Miriam tried to fight it with poultices and whispered prayers, but his breath grew shallow, his skin burning. One night, as she dabbed his forehead with damp cloth, he mistook her for his long-dead daughter. "My Sarah," he murmured, smiling faintly before slipping into stillness. At dawn, he was gone. They buried him without ceremony in the strip of earth by the docks, the place where so many of Savannah's forgotten dead lay unmarked. Miriam placed a stone there, small and smooth, pressing it into the soil when no one was looking. It was the only monument she could give him. Back in the cellar, she felt the silence close around her like a vice. Naomi had been taken. Ruth was unraveling. Elijah was gone. All that remained was the powder hidden behind the Madeira casks, waiting like a whisper of possibility. She touched the wooden box, her fingers trembling not with fear but with resolve. That evening, Ruth stumbled into the cellar, her eyes rimmed red. "Why do they keep taking?" she asked, voice breaking. Miriam pulled her close. Feeling the girl's thin frame shudder, she had no answer that could soothe the wound, so she offered something else. "There are ways out," she whispered. "Daniel, the river apprentice, you know him? He knows the marshes, knows how to vanish on the tide." Ruth looked up, confusion cutting through her grief. Miriam squeezed her hand. "Not yet, but when the time comes, you'll be ready." Above them, the Blackwells' mansion buzzed with preparations for the New Year's banquet. Margaret ordered silks and garlands. Edward summoned musicians, and the city's most powerful men accepted invitations. They would drink from Miriam's decanters, raise their glasses under glittering chandeliers. never imagining that judgment was already brewing in the shadows below. Miriam closed the cellar door behind her, the sound echoing like a seal upon a pact. She would endure the days ahead serving as she always had, but inside the clock had already started ticking toward the night when Savannah's laughter would curdle into screams. The days crept forward like beads on a rosary, each one marked by Margaret Blackwell's shrill commands and Edward's restless pacing. Preparations for the New Year's banquet consumed the household. Garlands of pine and holly arrived from the countryside, chandeliers were polished until they gleamed like ice, and musicians rehearsed in the hall. For Savannah's elite, it would be the grandest celebration of the winter season. For Miriam, it was the silent countdown toward reckoning. In the cellar, she worked alone, surrounded by the scents of cork oak and damp stone. Each evening, she checked the hidden wooden box tucked behind the Madeira shelf. Inside, wrapped in cloth, lay the powder that would shift the balance of power in ways no chain or whip could prevent. Arsenic trioxide so pale it looked like sugar, so fine it sifted through her fingers like flour. Years ago, a clerk at a chemist's shop had slipped it to her with a wink, pretending it was pest control. Miriam had taken it, unsure if she would ever find the moment to use it. Now the moment loomed. She decided to test its strength again. From the kitchen, she stole a heel of stale bread, soaked it in broth, and sprinkled the faintest dust upon it. She set it in the corner of the cellar where the dock rats prowled for scraps. At dawn, she returned to find one lying, twisted jaws, rigid eyes glazed. The sight filled her not with horror, but with grim certainty. She swept the body aside and recorded the measure in her memory. Cooking might have been the art of others. Her art was precision dosage calculation. Arsenic was no rare secret in 1850s Savannah. Chemists sold it freely as rat poison, housewives sprinkled it in kitchens. Even merchants used it in bright green dyes for wallpaper and gowns. Its presence was everywhere, hidden in plain sight. Few questioned its dangers. Fewer still imagined it could ever be turned against masters themselves. Miriam knew better now. This powder was more than vermin's bane. It was power waiting to be measured into a glass. That night, as she cleaned the brass mirror fixed to the cellar wall, her reflection startled her. The woman staring back was older than she remembered, hollow-eyed hair, streaked with gray, yet her gaze was steady, harder than the glass itself. For years she had lived unseen, her identity consumed by silence. Now in that reflection she glimpsed not a servant but an arbiter. She whispered to her own image, "They will taste justice as sure as they have tasted these wines." The next day brought another reminder of what was at stake. Ruth tripped into the cellar with eyes swollen from weeping. She clutched the ribbon that had once tied Naomi's braids. "She's gone forever," she said in a voice too calm for her years. Miriam wrapped an arm around her. "Not forever," she answered softly. "There are paths out of Savannah. Daniel knows the river channels. He's helped others before." Ruth blinked, startled by the suggestion. Miriam did not explain further. Secrecy was survival, but she pressed the idea into the girl's grief like planting a seed. Upstairs, Margaret summoned Miriam to discuss the wine list for the banquet. "The mayor prefers his Madeira sweet," she announced, rifling through folded menus. "Caldwell will expect cognac, and Dr. Cartwright insists on port after supper. See that each decanter is flawless. This night will restore Edward's reputation." Her eyes narrowed. "And yours, Miriam, depends on perfection." Miriam bowed her head, murmuring obedience, but inside she felt the words like sparks. Flawless. Perfect. Yes, the night would be flawless, but not in the way Margaret imagined. Later, Edward himself appeared at the cellar door, already flushed with drink. He leaned against the casks, the air heavy with the smell of spirits on his breath. "You'll have the cordials ready," he slurred. "The toast must impress. The mayor, Caldwell, Cartwright, even Deputy Cole. They must taste the best Savannah can offer. They'll remember my name when the fireworks blaze." His hand slapped a barrel for emphasis before he stumbled back upstairs. Miriam watched him go, her face expressionless. Inside, a different fire burned. They would remember, yes, but not as he intended. That evening, she rehearsed the plan in her mind as carefully as she once memorized the inventory of wines. First, a decoy, someone to fall ill without dying, a distraction to draw attention away from her true work. She thought of Miss Hale, the temperance-minded daughter of a shipping magnate who refused strong drink and demanded lemonade instead. Miriam would prepare a special glass for her laced with just enough powder to bring violent sickness, but not death. While the hall buzzed with alarm, Miriam could move undisturbed. Then would come the cordials, the final toast of the night delivered with flourish into crystal glasses. Blackwell, Caldwell, Cartwright, and Deputy Cole each would raise a cup prepared by her hands. Each would swallow the fate they had written into her life and the lives of countless others. Down in the cellar, Miriam held the cork with the carved cross again, rubbing her thumb across its grooves. Once it had marked a night of celebration, she served without joy. Now it was her talisman, proof that memories could be sharpened into blades. She tucked it back into her apron, her heart steady. The nights grew shorter. Each day the mansion swelled with more guests, more deliveries, more noise. But in the cellar, silence ruled. Silence and the faint whisper of powder that promised an end to silence forever. Soon, she told herself, as she measured wine into gleaming decanters. Soon the chandeliers would glitter. The orchestra would play, the guests would laugh, and beneath it all, her justice would flow like wine into their veins. The final week of December descended on Savannah with a chill wind sweeping in from the river, carrying the smell of pine and salt across the city. Inside the Blackwell household, however, the air was feverish with preparation. Margaret stormed from room to room, inspecting garlands, scolding maids, and demanding perfection at every turn. The Athenaeum Hall, rented for the grand occasion, had been transformed into a glittering stage of chandeliers and gilded mirrors. It was meant to be Edward Blackwell's redemption proof to creditors and rivals alike that his empire of ships still commanded respect. Down below in the cool damp of the cellar, Miriam moved with the calm of someone rehearsing her own liturgy. She cataloged the casks and bottles with methodical care, but her mind was consumed by something far more intricate, the choreography of vengeance. Every decanter she polished, every cork she checked, every glass she held up to the lantern light became part of her silent blueprint. Margaret's voice rang sharp through the stairwell one afternoon. "Miriam, see that the cognac is set aside for Caldwell. The mayor prefers Madeira, sweet not dry, and Dr. Cartwright insists on port with dessert." Her eyes glittered with the hunger of ambition. "This night will decide Edward's place in the city. Do not fail me." Miriam bowed her head, murmuring, "Yes, mistress," but her thoughts turned elsewhere. Sweet Madeira, heavy port, smooth cognac, each a vessel, each a weapon waiting to be chosen. That evening, Edward himself lurched into the cellar, cheeks flushed with brandy. He leaned close, his breath hot with drink. "The cordials, woman. Make them strong. The final toast must dazzle them all. Mayor Stevens, Caldwell, Cartwright, even Deputy Cole, they must taste the best Savannah can offer. They'll remember my name when the fireworks blaze." His hand slapped a barrel for emphasis before he stumbled back upstairs. Miriam watched him go, her face expressionless. Inside, a different fire burned. They would remember, yes, but not as he intended. She returned to her wooden box, lifting the cloth to reveal the pale powder within. By lantern glow, she divided it into paper twists, each marked with the tiniest scratch for strength. Some would bring sickness, others death. She slid them into a hidden pocket sewn inside her apron, the black fabric hiding secrets better than any lock. Still, Miriam knew appearances mattered as much as precision. She began cultivating her alibi with care. Complaining softly of aching joints, she slowed her movements in front of others, rubbing her wrists and knees where anyone might notice. "Don't you dare fall ill before the banquet," Margaret snapped one afternoon. "Collapse after if you must, but not before." Miriam nodded meekly, lowering her eyes to mask the glint of cold resolve within. Ruth remained fragile, her grief for Naomi unrelenting. She drifted through her duties like a shadow, singing less, speaking only when pressed. Miriam shielded her as best she could, assigning her to tasks within sight, away from Deputy Cole's watchful eye. Yet Miriam also prepared her for escape. In whispered conversations near the kitchen door, she told Daniel, the young river apprentice, what must be done. "When the hall erupts in chaos, you take her," she urged. "Through the marshes, down the tide, northward, don't look back." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "For Elijah," he murmured, "and for Naomi." At night, while the mansion above glittered with rehearsals and rehearsed laughter, Miriam lit her lantern in the cellar and studied herself in the brass mirror. The same gaunt face stared back, eyes ringed with sleeplessness. But the reflection no longer looked broken, it looked deliberate. A hand steady enough to pour, precise enough to measure, patient enough to wait until the moment was ripe. 2 nights before the banquet, she slipped into the hall after everyone had gone to bed. She walked between the rows of chairs past the towering chandeliers, imagining the sound of crystal clinking and music swelling. She placed her hand on the polished mahogany table where Savannah's most powerful would rest their elbows, never suspecting that their last toast had already been prepared for them in silence below. The image was seared into her mind, Margaret's haughty smile frozen in panic, Caldwell's swollen face falling into his plate, Cole gasping for air, Cartwright clutching at his chest while his knowledge failed him. She did not dream of triumph. There was no joy left in her heart, but of balance. A scale tipped too long against her, and those like her would finally even out. Back in the cellar, she touched the cork with the tiny cross, the relic she had carried for years. Once it had been proof of servitude. Now it was a marker of resolve. She tucked it back into her apron, its weight pressing against the packet of arsenic as though past and present had fused into one. The night of New Year's Eve drew closer. Fireworks were already being stacked by the river, the city buzzing with anticipation. To Savannah's elite, the banquet promised glory, spectacle, and indulgence. To Miriam, it was a stage set for judgment, and when the candles blazed and glasses lifted, the reckoning would pour as surely as the wine itself. By the time dusk fell on the final night of 1851, Savannah shimmered with anticipation. Carriages rattled through the cobbled streets, wheels crunching over stray pine needles left by decorators. The Athenaeum Hall blazed with light, its windows glowing like lanterns against the cold. Inside, servants hurried to arrange platters and decanters, while musicians tuned their instruments in the gallery above. It was the kind of spectacle that cemented reputations, and Edward Blackwell had staked everything on it. Miriam walked the cellar stairs with deliberate calm, balancing trays of bottles that gleamed under lantern light. Above her, laughter floated down, rich and careless. She set each decanter in its place on the banquet sideboard, polishing the glass until it shone. In her apron pocket, folded paper twists waited silently, each marked with scratches invisible to all but her. Guests arrived in a flurry of velvet cloaks and polished boots. Mayor Stevens bowed gallantly to Margaret Blackwell, who stood at the entrance like a queen greeting her court. Caldwell, the banker, trailed close behind, his heavy rings glinting under the chandeliers. Dr. Cartwright, freshly returned from the docks, carried himself with the smug air of a man convinced of his own authority. Even Deputy Cole in uniform took his place among the honored, his hand never straying far from the baton at his side. Miriam stayed to the edges, pouring wine with steady precision, her gaze never betraying what she carried within. She marked each face, each smile, each careless word. These were the men who had profited from suffering, who had treated human lives as coins to shuffle across ledgers. Tonight they would sip their own undoing. The first toast of the evening belonged to Edward Blackwell. He rose at the head of the long mahogany table, raising a goblet of Madeira. To Savannah's future, he proclaimed, his voice booming. May our city thrive as bright as the fireworks to come. Laughter and applause followed, crystal glasses lifted high. Miriam moved quietly among them, refilling goblets, her hand steady as stone. But her eyes flicked toward a pale young woman seated halfway down the table, Miss Hale, the daughter of a shipping magnate. Known for her delicate constitution, she drank only lemonade. Miriam had anticipated her presence. In the kitchen earlier, she had prepared a separate glass, its rim sweetened with sugar to disguise the faint bitterness within. A measured dose, not enough to kill, only to wrench the evening into chaos. When the tray was carried out, Miriam gave careful instruction. This glass is for Miss Hale, she said, her voice calm. The servant nodded and delivered it to the unsuspecting girl. Miriam turned back to her decanters, her expression unchanged. The banquet continued, music swelling as dishes were brought forth in shining procession. Roast pheasant, glazed ham, candied orange peels, Savannah's abundance displayed like a crown. Conversation rose and fell, punctuated by bursts of laughter. Miriam moved among them, silent as shadow. Then came the sound she had been waiting for. A sudden gasp, a chair scraping violently against the floor. Guests turned to see Miss Hale clutching her stomach, her pale face drained of color. Her mother cried out, rising in panic as the girl retched onto the floor. Shouts erupted, servants rushing with cloths and basins. Dr. Cartwright shoved his chair back, striding to the girl with the self-importance of a savior. Margaret Blackwell's face blanched. "What is happening?" she demanded, though her voice wavered. Edward barked for calm, waving his hand as though sheer command could erase the scene. A touch of nerves, he declared, though unease rippled down the table. Behind the commotion, Miriam continued to pour her motions unhurried. The distraction was perfect. While eyes fixed on the sick girl, she reached for the decanters of cordials, lifting them with practiced grace. Into each, destined for Blackwell, Caldwell Cartwright, and Deputy Cole, she slipped the contents of her folded paper twists. The powder vanished into the rich spiced liquid masked entirely by sweetness and heat. She stirred gently, ensuring no trace remained. When the decanters gleamed once more on the sideboard, she stepped back into shadow, her heart steady. The first move had been made. Miss Hale's collapse would be dismissed as frailty, but it had cracked the hall's veneer of control. Soon, when the final toast was raised, the true unraveling would begin. Music faltered, then resumed. Servants carried the stricken girl upstairs to a guest chamber. Laughter returned in cautious ripples, guests clinging to composure. Margaret forced a smile, though her hands trembled as she adjusted the folds of her gown. "The evening will continue," she declared, voice sharp. "Savannah's finest are not so easily undone." From her place near the cellar door, Miriam watched it all, the pride, the arrogance, the desperate grip on appearances. She touched the cork with the tiny cross inside her apron, a relic pressed against the arsenic packets like a seal. Soon, she told herself, very soon, the hall glittered, unaware that its brilliance was about to collapse into darkness. The hall pulsed with forced laughter, the kind that tried to push away unease. Servants swept across the floor, clearing the mess left by Miss Hale's collapse, while the orchestra resumed a tune too cheerful for the tension in the air. Margaret Blackwell's face was tight, her smile brittle as she moved between guests, insisting that all was well. Edward, red-cheeked with wine, slammed his goblet onto the table. "We will not let one fainting girl spoil the evening," he roared. "Bring out the cordials. Tonight Savannah drinks to a new year." Miriam's hands did not tremble as she stepped forward with the decanters polished to a glassy shine. Each one glowed amber beneath the chandeliers. She carried them to the head of the table with practiced grace, bowing her head slightly as she placed them within Edward's reach. The powders she had measured so carefully swirled invisibly in the liquid, mingling with spice and heat. No one noticed. No one ever noticed her. Edward filled the glasses with theatrical flourish, pouring first for Mayor Stevens, then for Caldwell, then Dr. Cartwright, then Deputy Cole. Finally, he raised his own. To prosperity, he declared, his voice booming against the vaulted ceiling. "To the glory of Savannah and the triumph of our endeavors." Crystal clinked as guests lifted their glasses in unison. Miriam lingered at the sideboard, her gaze sweeping across the room, memorizing faces as lips touched rims. The first minutes passed quietly. The orchestra shifted to a stately waltz. Caldwell leaned back, smug, boasting of new trade routes. Cartwright lectured the mayor about naval medicine, while Cole chuckled darkly at some private jest. Edward himself basked in their company as though the banquet had already restored his fortunes. Then, Caldwell's hand slipped from his goblet. His face flushed deep red before draining of color, sweat beading along his brow. "Hot," he rasped, tugging at his collar. His words cut short as he lurched forward, striking the table with a thud that rattled the crystal. Wine spilled like blood across the linen. Gasps rose around the hall. Caldwell convulsed, his ringed fingers clawing at the air. Margaret shrieked, her composure shattering. Guests stumbled back from the table chairs, toppling gowns, rustling in panic. Deputy Cole barked for order, but his voice faltered as his knees buckled. He grasped for the table, knocking over a platter of sugared oranges before collapsing to the floor. His baton rolled from his hand, clattering uselessly across the marble. Dr. Cartwright staggered next. His expertise, his arrogance, his medical authority all dissolved in the sweat that streamed down his face. He pressed a hand to his chest, gasping, eyes wide with the terror of a man who understood exactly what was happening, but could do nothing to stop it. "Poison," he croaked before doubling over in violent retching. Mayor Stevens froze, his goblet trembling in his hand as he watched the men collapse around him. For one breathless instant, he feared the same poison burned in his throat. His eyes darted to the crystal rim, to the amber cordial still swirling within. He set it down with shaking fingers, relief flooding his face as he realized he had been spared. Yet the fear clung to him, a reminder that even Savannah's highest seat was only one sip away from the same fate. Panic tore through the hall. Women fainted. Men shouted for their carriages. Servants fled through side doors. The orchestra stopped, mid-note bows frozen against strings. Glass shattered as guests dropped their drinks, fear spreading faster than fire. And then Edward Blackwell himself coughed a sound sharp and ragged. He slammed his fist onto the table, but it did not still the tremor in his body. His eyes bulged, his lips foamed. Margaret, he choked, reaching blindly for his wife. She clutched at him, screaming as he crumpled against her gown. Through it all, Miriam remained still. She moved among the chaos with a mask of concern, helping escort panicked guests to the doors, guiding trembling hands toward the exit. None suspected her. None even looked at her. She was as always invisible. But this time, invisibility was her shield, her freedom. From across the hall, Ruth caught her eye. The girl stood frozen at the service door, Daniel's hand gripping her wrist. Miriam gave the faintest nod. That was enough. Daniel pulled Ruth into the shadows, leading her toward the marsh and the river beyond. Margaret, wild-eyed, staggered toward Miriam, seizing her arm with desperate strength. "Help them!" she screamed. "Do something!" Her nails dug into Miriam's skin, leaving red crescents. Miriam met her gaze, calm, steady, unflinching. "There is nothing to be done," she said, her voice flat as stone. Realization dawned slowly on Margaret's face, horror widening her eyes. "You?" she whispered. Miriam did not answer. She pulled her arm free and turned away, letting Margaret collapse beside her writhing husband. The hall was no longer a banquet. It was a battlefield. Crystal shards sparkled like weapons on the floor. Bodies convulsed and groaned. Power and wealth, gowns and jewels, all reduced to the same trembling flesh, the same gasping breath. Judgment had come not with swords or guns, but poured quietly into a glass. From the sideboard, Miriam picked up an empty goblet and set it carefully back in place. Her face betrayed nothing, but inside she felt the cold weight of balance. The scales had finally tipped, and outside the river waited, carrying Ruth and Daniel away into the dark, while the city's finest crumbled under the chandeliers. The dawn of January 1st broke gray and cold over Savannah, but the Athenaeum Hall lay darker than the sky above it. The chandeliers still hung, glittering, their candles long burned down to pools of wax, but the laughter they had illuminated hours before was gone. Physicians and constables swarmed through the wreckage, stepping carefully around shards of crystal and stained linens. The air reeked of sweat vomit and spilled wine. The great New Year's banquet meant to redeem Edward Blackwell's name was being whispered as a massacre before the sun had fully risen. Edward himself was dead, collapsed at the foot of the table, his fine coat soiled and his lips flecked with foam. Caldwell's swollen body had been carried to a side chamber, draped hastily with a cloth. Deputy Cole lay motionless where he had fallen, his uniform still clinging to him like a cruel joke. Dr. Cartwright had managed to gasp out a few last words before the poison silenced him as well. Margaret survived, but barely, her body weakened by vomiting and tremors. She clutched at anyone who passed, demanding answers, demanding retribution. The Savannah Daily Chronicle wasted no time. By midday, a headline blared across its pages: "Savannah's elite struck by poison at New Year's feast." The article spoke of calamity, of tragedy, of a conspiracy that must be rooted out. It recounted Edward's stature as a shipping magnate, Caldwell's service to the city, Cartwright's role as naval surgeon, and even Cole's loyalty as lawman. Nowhere did it mention Naomi sold into bondage, Ruth's hollow eyes, Elijah's body left to rot in a dockside grave. Those stories did not sell papers. Whispers spread faster than print. Some claimed the wine had been tainted at the docks. Others suspected foreign saboteurs. But soon enough, the blame narrowed to the one place no one of power wanted to examine too closely: the cellar. A servant's hand, invisible yet essential, must have guided the poison into their cups. Constables stormed through the Blackwell estate, demanding names. They found frightened housemaids, stammering kitchen boys, but no Miriam. By the time the search began, she was gone. Some swore they saw her slip into the night as chaos overtook the hall, vanishing down the narrow lane that led to the river. Others whispered that she never left at all, that she drank her own measure of arsenic in the cellar, her body swallowed by the same silence she had endured for decades. No corpse was ever found. Miss Hale survived her collapse. Physicians declared it a passing illness, a frailty of constitution, and the newspapers quickly forgot her name. But those who remembered the banquet knew her sickness had played another role. It had bought Miriam the silence she needed to lace the cordials without suspicion. The distraction had been perfect, a feint that allowed judgment to slip quietly into the glasses of Savannah's proudest men. Ruth's absence was noted days later along with Daniel's. Margaret claimed they must have been part of the plot, though she could offer no proof. A constable muttered about the marshes, about hidden skiffs that ferried runaways north, but no one pursued far. The city's concern was not to rescue Ruth, but to punish the memory of Miriam. In response to the horror, new laws were drafted in hurried sessions of the legislature. No slave was to be trusted with the keeping of wine or the service of drink without strict supervision. Cellars would be locked keys held only by masters. To the public, these measures promised safety. To those in bondage, it was yet another tightening of chains. Yet beneath those chains, another story grew. In the kitchens and quarters of Savannah, in whispered conversations passed down the river docks, Miriam's name carried a different weight. She was not a monster, not a shadowed hand of chaos, but a woman who had seized the only weapon left to her and aimed it at the men who had crushed lives like insects beneath boots. Her vengeance was whispered as justice, her disappearance as freedom. At night, some swore they could still hear her footsteps in the cellar of the Athenaeum, pacing between the casks, counting invisible measures. Others said she had taken the river road, vanishing northward, as Ruth and Daniel had done, trading her life of silence for one of ghosts. Savannah carried on, its streets bustling again, its ships moving up and down the river. But something had cracked beneath the glitter. The Banquet had shown the city that even its grandest halls could be undone by a hand they never saw. And as the months passed, rumors drifted up the coast. A young girl and a river apprentice spotted in North Carolina. A woman's scarf found near a ferry landing in Virginia. No one could prove it was Miriam's. Perhaps she had perished. Perhaps she had lived. The mystery only deepened with each telling feeding the legend. In the quiet of slave quarters, though no one doubted, they raised their heads a little higher when her name was spoken. Miriam had not simply vanished. She had become a story too strong to bury. A year later, the night air of Philadelphia smelled of snow and coal smoke rather than salt and pine. In the narrow streets of the Quaker district, bells rang out for another New Year's Eve. Crowds gathered in the square, laughing, bundled against the cold. None of them knew the names of the dead in Savannah, nor the story of the banquet that ended in screams beneath a chandelier. But two figures in that city did: Ruth and Daniel, survivors of a night that had rewritten their lives. They had traveled north through marsh and river, guided by the hands of strangers who asked no questions. In barns and ferries, they whispered Miriam's name like a prayer, clutching the only token left behind, a cork with a small cross, kept safe in Ruth's apron pocket. By the time they reached Philadelphia, Ruth was pale and thin, but her eyes held a fire Miriam had lit in her. Daniel found work at a livery, and Ruth with a Quaker family that offered her a bed and food in exchange for labor. They built lives in fragments, cautious but free. On the anniversary of their escape, Ruth and Daniel met at a small church, its candles glowing through frosted windows. After the service, they walked together by the Schuylkill River, its waters black under a thin slice of moon. Ruth pulled the cork from her pocket and held it out. She carried this until the end, she said. Daniel took it, turning it over in his hands, feeling the grooves of the tiny cross. Then we'll carry it forward, he answered. The cork was nothing more than scrap wood, yet in their hands it felt like a monument more lasting than stone. Far to the south, Savannah had already buried its dead and moved on. The Blackwell estate was broken, sold off to cover debts. Margaret retreated to her family in Virginia, a widow draped in mourning. The Chronicle still referred to the night as the New Year's poisoning, warning planters and merchants alike of the dangers of giving slaves too much responsibility. New restrictions tightened, new locks were placed on cellars. The official record reduced Miriam to a footnote, a female servant of approximately 40 responsible for administering poison at the Athenaeum Hall. No name, no history, no mention of the lives torn from her. But history has always had two tellings. In the city's polished parlors, Miriam was erased or vilified. In the quarters and shanties, her story became a flame passed from one tongue to another. She was not a nameless servant. She was the woman who poured justice into crystal, the cellarman who measured death as carefully as she once measured Madeira. Mothers whispered her name to children as proof that even the powerless could strike at those who believed themselves untouchable. In whispered gatherings by firelight, they told of how she outwitted her masters, how she turned the very symbol of their wealth, fine imported wine, into the weapon of their undoing. Some claimed she had escaped living free under another name. Others believed she had chosen silence, drinking the poison herself, so her secret could never be forced from her. The uncertainty only deepened the legend. Miriam had become both ghost and hero, martyr and survivor. For Ruth, the truth mattered less than the legacy. Each time she felt the cork in her pocket, she remembered Miriam's steady eyes in the cellar, the calm in her voice when all others screamed. Miriam had shown her that freedom was not given. It had to be claimed sometimes at unbearable cost. That knowledge carried Ruth through the hardships of the North, the suspicion, the hunger, the fear of capture. It would carry her for the rest of her life. On that snowy bridge in Philadelphia, Ruth let the cork drop into Daniel's palm. "She's with us," she said simply. Daniel nodded, closing his fingers around it. The river beneath them flowed dark and steady, carrying the cork away if he chose to release it, carrying echoes of a story the city above had already forgotten. But neither he nor Ruth would let it vanish. And so Miriam lived on, not in the pages of official reports, but in the invisible network of memory and the whispers of those who knew the truth. Her story traveled along river routes and back alleys, carried by dock hands and field hands, by women at market and men at the forge. Each telling sharpened her into legend: the servant who poisoned her master, the cellarman who turned the New Year's toast into judgment. The Athenaeum Hall still stood in Savannah, its chandeliers polished for new banquets, its floors scrubbed of stains. But beneath the glitter, shadows lingered. Guests still raised their glasses, but sometimes in the pause before drinking, they glanced uneasily at the rim, as if remembering that once in that same hall, power and wealth had meant nothing at all. The legend asked no forgiveness, offered no easy moral. It left only a question echoing across time: when justice is denied to the living, what choices remain to the silenced? Miriam's answer had been poured into crystal, and Savannah had never forgotten the taste.